first of all, thank you very much, Adam and Kate, who've looked after me wonderfully, and Mark for organising it. I mean, and sometimes these things sound like they're formal. They're not. It was such a pleasure. It really was. Thank you. And they've looked after me wonderfully, and I've enjoyed being in Los Angeles. It's sort of 30 years since I was here. Not quite. And somebody in the audience, I think, is something of a historian of Oscar Fischinger. I didn't realise. Someone's been involved with Oscar Fischinger. When I came first, I was the guest of Elfriede Fischinger, who I liked very much, and she was a whirlwind, and so my introduction to Los Angeles some 30 years ago was through this incredible woman who never talked about anything but Oscar. Always about Oscar. And walking down through this little bit of Hollywood, I thought this is the closest I'll ever get to being involved in Hollywood cinema. But it's not quite true. I just remembered that one of the things I did, I became, for some reason, because I'd experimented with one of the first approaches to digital, then called computer film, in the UK, I was taken on by 20th Century Fox to be an advisor for a detective story that was set in the 21st century. And it was I was brought in to organise and advise them on how to have all these things around the set which looked like they belonged in a detective story in the 21st century, which they called gizmos. Right, I had to have all these gizmos, and they brought me in because of they wanted these gizmos to be in the latest system using digital, and I went through. And at that time, I'm not going to show it tonight. At that time, I had made my first and the first digital film in the UK, and it took me 9 months to make 8 seconds of film. And so my advice to them was, don't do it digitally, fake it, right? Do it by ordinary animation. So the director was a wonderful guy called Sam Wanamaker. I don't know if people know Sam Wanamaker, but he was an actor in the USA, and he came to England to direct this film, and then he became the main leading light for the development of the Globe Theatre, the new Globe Theatre, the rebuilding of it. And I had seen him curiously when I was a child of about 14 in a play called The Rainmaker. And there I was with Sam Wanamaker as the director. And actually he was a really nice person, very nice guy, very committed to the Globe Theatre and all of that. The film itself, and I was involved on all the script conferences, the script was absolutely awful. It was so bad, and it was a big eye-opener for me that all the discussions for the script were, would a child of 6 be able to understand this? Truly, that's how it worked. Would a child of 6 or 8 be able to understand this? And fortunately, they pulled the plug on it. Well, they hadn't paid me by then when they pulled the plug. So there was the executive director, not the executive producer for 20th Century Fox. He was actually an employee of 20th Century, and he was already, I guess, about 65, 70 years old. said, look, I've been doing this work and nobody's paid me. He says, oh, how much? What do we owe you? So, I mean, I could have made up almost anything. And I said, well, actually, it was about £200 that we agreed, which is minuscule now, but probably was about the equivalent of $1,000 or something like that. Even that was small. And so he said, well, come into my office. We went into the office. This is Kaplan. He's sitting behind his desk. Behind him is this wonderful fake Monet that I asked him about it. I said, where did you get this? Am I allowed to go on doing this?
Yeah, a few minutes.
And it's more interesting than the film show. And so this is fake Monet, and I said, that Monet, where did that? It was a beautiful one. It really was great and a large picture. And I said, where did you get this? And he said, well, actually, when we do a film, and we need pictures around in the set, we get very good artists to make copies and then we, the directors and the producers, when the film is over, we take them. And he said this was one of those. And then he said, I'm going on a bit. And then he said, what do you do? And I said, well, actually, it's very hard to tell you. I said, I'm an experimental filmmaker. Oh, he said, so he said, well, what sort of thing do you do? So I explained to him that at that time I was making performance work with double projection, and sometimes I was actually performing in front of the screen and live, and there was a relationship between what I was doing live and what was going on the screen. I said, but you that's nothing like Hollywood. And he said, no, hang on a minute. He said, actually, when film started in Hollywood, when I was young, he said, we did some things like that. And he said, we had this piece with an Italian guy who, the film was of an Italian guy with a horse and a cart that was pulled across by the horse, and it was on the screen. We had film of it. But as the film went on, we actually had the Italian guy with the horse coming across the screen live. And so I thought, oh, that's interesting. And then he said, we had a big problem. We were going to go up the coast to San Francisco, and we got the horse and the cart onto the railway station, on the railway station platform, and he said, somebody came up to one of the officials came up to us and said, you can't take that horse. You can't take it. He says, there's an outbreak of hoof and mouth disease. I don't know whether it's called that now. In England it would be called foot and mouth disease, hoof and mouth disease. He said, so we had a problem. We got this horse that we can't take on the train. He said, so I just sent one of the people who are on the production. I said, go out and buy me 4 buckets, 4 pails. He said pails. I don't know whether what would be the right term in America.
Pails, good.
A pail. He said 4 pails. Get me 4 pails and a gallon of disinfectant. Right. So he said we put the 4 pails on the platform, filled them with disinfectant, and each of us took a leg from the horse and stuck it in one of these pails, and without letting the legs of the horse get onto the platform, we lifted it onto the train, and we did our tour up through all the way up through to San Francisco. So, I mean, I guess there was an experimental film culture. Anyway, so tonight, it's because I've had a glass of wine or two, I suppose. I'm a bit relaxed because it's been such a nice trip over here. And thank you for coming, and especially those people who I have a lot of sympathy for who've been to the other programs as well. It is a different. I don't think there's any overlaps, are there? I can't think.
Unless somebody went to CalArts.
So what do we? Yeah. Now there's a couple of special things tonight. One special thing for me is we're looking at the work called Finity, which is a new version for single screen. It was originally a multi-screen work that I showed at the Tate Modern in Britain. And I've made a single screen version of it before, but for my trip here, I was a bit unhappy about things, and when I see it for the first time again here, I might be still unhappy about it. I'm not utterly convinced, but this is a kind of test premiere of Finity. That's the first thing. Then there's the Reign of the Vampire, which is. There's a subtitle to that. I don't think, have we got the subtitle? The subtitle actually for the Reign of the Vampire is Reign of the Vampire, or How to Screw the CIA, or How to Screw the CIA ? Right? And this comes from my paranoid period, when I was I felt that like I have to be on the CIA list. Of course, that was never possible. I wasn't that important, but it was. We all had these. It made us feel better almost that we might be on the CIA list, but it was my response, a kind of response to the way in which I felt impotent against the industrial military complex, and I was using found footage almost exclusively found footage that I was picking up from the garbage cans in Soho, and I had a huge bank of them, but I only ever chose images that somehow or other had a charge for me, and at that time it was a psychological charge related to my to this kind of paranoia about the world in general, which I'm very pleased to say I got over. Even though the paranoia, the idea that everyone's talking about you and so on, it's still true. Even though I got over it, it was a justified response, certainly at that time, and I'm not sure it isn't coming back. The justification of that paranoid response. So that's one of the pieces that I'm going to show. Now the other thing which has been added to the program, which wasn't in the original program, I don't have many heroes, no more heroes anymore, but one of my heroes has been Jonas Mekas. And for people who don't know about Jonas Mekas, he died. I'd only learned since I got here that he recently died. Now I wasn't a friend of Jonas Mekas, but I knew him very well. We had a lot of contact with each other, and it's perhaps an exaggeration, but I'm not sure it is. What we think of as the experimental film world, in many ways, I don't think might have happened in the same way as it did without Jonas Mekas. He was a filmmaker, but his impact was that he really looked at the whole cultural situation and promoted the development of experimental film and encouraged people and provided a context for it. I mean, any other person might have said, okay, my career is going to be to make myself famous and to be known as a filmmaker. But Jonas actually had a overview of what of a kind of cultural situation that needed an institution, in a way, an institution. He was then a major founder of the New York Filmmakers Cooperative, and people gathered around that. He started Anthology Film Archive, on Anthology Cinema, and then in Europe, even though there was a kind of start of some independent experimental filmmaking, because of the New York Film Co-op, people in Europe said, "Okay, you will follow that model," and started a cooperative film cooperatives in various places in Europe. The London one particularly took over. I'm always surprised that it happened in America, though in recent years I have looked. There was some kind of tradition of cooperatives. I assumed that, because in America they destroyed the whole idea of socialism, that there was no such thing as cooperatives. But actually there were some cooperatives, and it was quite radical for Jonas Mekas to promote the idea of a cooperative in America. And it has been a big influence. Now, it just happens that I was invited. I met him quite often, but I was invited to a special screening in England. I guess it must have been 6 years ago, at the Serpentine Gallery, where they had a sort of retrospective of Jonas Mekas. But because it was his 90th birthday, they also had a birthday party evening. And I was invited, and I went to the thing, and I always then had my little Sony, not this one, but I had a Sony camera in my pocket, a small one, and I always had it with me. And I just, during the performances and the events of the birthday party, I took a little bit of film, not with any intention in mind. I just took a bit of film, and when I looked at it, I thought, okay, because I was doing a series of portraits. There's another portrait on tonight called Finnegan, again Finnegan. Mm-hmm. I did a series of portraits at that time. And I looked at the stuff that I'd shot, only 3 minutes for this little event with Jonas. And so it's a kind of portrait of Jonas, and Adam and I thought it might be quite nice to show it tonight as an additional thing in the programme. So there we go, now we can look at it.
China Tea.
Yes.
Was that always a double projector piece?
It was, yes.
So what possessed you in 1965 to make an 8mm double projector piece?
Again, it was a bit to do with, but first of all, my father was making bits and pieces of film with 8mm, right? And he had a beautiful Umig camera, very nice, good quality camera. There was also, for some reason, a company produced an early washing machine, right? A very early one. And to encourage people to buy it, they gave away a Russian 8mm camera with it, right? And so I had two cameras. And I'd already made a couple of 8mm things, but nothing special. And so I set up this still life and shot it with two cameras simultaneously. So I just ran them, and so then I decided I would project them side by side, and that's how it came about. And then the music was one of those prepared piano things that I did around that time, 1964. I've told this story once before, that I don't mind. My wife is Judith is a good pianist, and when we were married, I found a slightly broken down old grand piano. and renovated it, restrung it, and worked on the action. But whilst I was doing it, I started to play around with, in this case, I had bits of stick, surgical applicators they were called, like bits of flexible bamboo, and I was sticking them into the strings and playing the music by flicking these things, and I was recording that. They weren't together, I mean it wasn't shot simultaneously with the sound, but I immediately put that sound on it because it had a Chinese quality. Of course it's pastiche, it's not real. So there you go.
But I'm wondering, you spoke at the Red Cat show about how narrative, for instance, didn't really interest you. I mean, the typical qualities of cinema that a lot of people are investigating, especially narrative, were not of much interest to you. But to start with this right at the beginning of your filmmaking is still pretty radical, even for the avant-garde, I feel. So
I don't think. I'm not sure. Not if you put it. Not if you put it against Maya Deren and people like that. I don't think so. And it's. I mean, it's. Though I at that time had no knowledge of Brackage, it's not so far away, and it's first-person first-person cinema, and it was, it's made. There's no protagonist other than the filmmaker, right? So that if there's a identification between the spectator and the film, it's through the camera, through the action of the camera, because there's nothing represented. So in normal cinema, the identification of the spectator moves from them to the represented characters. If you don't have that, then if there is an identification, the identification is with the camera. Now, of course, I wasn't thinking about that. It was more that from the tradition. I suppose I was thinking about, because I was very influenced by Kafka. I was thinking about the first-person novel, and the idea that it's the thing that's within that you follow through when you're reading Kafka with The Castle, for example. You are K, but K is also the author. Now, again, I was thinking about it, but it's not. It was never a. While you're doing that, you're not as clear about it as you might be when you think about it later. It comes from not completely the unconscious, but it's not like it's from a formed intention or understanding, and it relies a lot on sort of picking up something in the cultural unconscious, not the collective unconscious, but perhaps in the cultural unconscious, and it comes through. For me, it comes through from initially from painting, and it's like how you might interpret painting into making film. I don't know. I mean, I never know for sure, and I'm very suspicious of my own rationalizations. I have to say, I am. I mean, I have to be. I'm not sure of my own rationalizations, and a lot of them are post-rationalizations.
Well, have especially with work that dates back a few decades, have your feelings about what the pieces are about changed pretty consistently over the years?
Yes, in lots of cases they do. I mean, for one of the things is I've become increasingly aware, if there's not a narrative, there's invariably what I now call a dramaturgy. There is a sort of there's a developmental thing in all the work. It's if it isn't a narrative, there's still something which is to do with a developing sequence in pretty much all the work, even if that development is really a very abstract, more musical kind, because in the visuals are musical. Their structure is like if you thought how you would make something that is a symphony or something. Sibelius, there's a big influence in a way on the structure, is Sibelius. I don't know who Sibelius wrote, I think it was 3, was it number 3, which was a continuous, it was I think the first continuous symphony without sections. I think it was 3. Anybody know better? Sibelius is 3rd, I think. That was a big influence on me, but I didn't like transpose that directly to, I'm going to make a film like Sibelius is 3rd.
Right.
It was, I remember that how I liked the way that this music was flowing from one thing to another.
Well, so what you said about China Tea and the subjective camera and identifying with the filmmaker point of view, but also the audience point of view, I really love thinking about all the multi-screen work in terms of that, because every multi-screen piece you have, I feel, is using the multiple screens in a different way.
Right.
I mean, Infinity is like, I mean, it's really quite ambitious and mad. Well, you can say that, I can't. But I'm wondering, this seems to me, in light of what you said about China Tea, to have very much to do with this idea of there not being one single subjective consciousness.
That's
experiencing this
very
stuff.
important to me. That idea that there isn't a single there isn't a single coordinating factor.
Yeah.
And that has been important all the way through, and that's why I think I started doing multi-projection right from the beginning. I started doing multi-projection, double projection, triple projection, like in Whitchurch Down, and the 4-screen film which I did after Manet, which I haven't shown here, but that then introduced specifically 4 viewpoints with the four actors, and it was about that diffusion of viewpoint that you didn't have. And it was very important for me in that opposition to narrative is that single viewpoint, linear passage through something, and what you're identifying with and who you're identifying with and what value system you're identifying. This is getting really too heavy, but if anyone wants to know what I think about that, one of the better essays that I've written is called Concerning the Spectator Placement in Film. It is worth reading if you're interested in what I might think about why I take up an anti-narrative position. So it's worth a little look.
And I have to ask, what did you think of your new cut of
Affinity? It's a little crazier than, in some ways, the coherence of relationship seems to have worked better in the multi-screen. Bringing them together makes it more dreamlike.
Yeah.
I kind of responded slightly differently to it, and it's like I am, because this is the first time I've seen it in this form on the screen. I've seen it whilst I've been editing it, and I had a previous single screen version which I showed at Take Britain, which I wasn't entirely happy with, which is why I've remade it. This is about almost 10 minutes shorter. But as a result of that, it's more like the sequences are more on top of each other. And it's for me now more like a dream structure than it was before. It's more almost more like how I might be waking up in the morning, and not quite, but that sort of feel
Yeah.
to it. Some of the sound I think is a bit lumpy. I think it could do with, if I go back, I'll probably level out some of the sound. But other bits of the sound I'm quite happy with, and because I don't hear very well, I'm not sure sometimes if sections are too loud. I'm very close to it now. What do other people think of it?
Yeah. Are there any questions or comments, maybe particularly about that piece?
Comments. I may have to come closer because I can't always hear.
I'll shout.
You'll shout.
I'll shout. Do you think that the multiple perspectives that you create take you more into the cultural consciousness by doing it that way? Is it like make it more of a access point to that?
Well, I think they open things up. They stop you having a certainty about how things relate to each other, and I want that uncertainty. Apart from anything else, because I get increasingly uncertain about the truths of things, even the truth of my own recollections of things. I'm constantly unsure whether my recollections are correct. I don't mean a loss of memory. I mean whether I've constructed my understanding of something correctly. Because I've had sort of experiences where I thought I knew what I encountered with other people, and then learned something about that situation later which was completely different. And I think that as I move on, I get more doubtful, and I to the point where I think one of the most important characteristics for us is doubt. In every respect, it's doubt. You get, in the self-portrait with Aldebaran one, it's doubt. It's not absolutely. I now have abandoned the word belief. Right? I try not to ever use the word belief. I believe in something, and in some ways it's scientific to be doubtful, to not know. And I like that, bringing that principle into art, right? To not know, I'm not expressing something to the audience that I know and I want them to know.
Yeah, well, that's why I ask about to use your word, cultural consciousness. That's why I ask about opening that doorway to the cultural unconscious, because that's how it feels to me looking at it.
Well, I mean, infinity, there's a number of sequences, but particularly the end sequence says that all the subjective things that occur, like all the images that have come from little fragments of my life, that are through all the way through, the end sequence puts that into the context of what is actually a condition of the world in its conflicts and that are going on at the present. So it is that contextualizes the subjective and personal. So that's a cultural. That is a representation of the culture, or a kind of response to the culture. But the culture, as it comes through to us through information, television, through memory of experiences and so on, but which are not something which is I'm kind of partly in control of, which is my personal life. I'm only partly in control of my personal life. I'm not even fully, nowhere near fully in control of my personal life. I'm a bit more, you've got a territory in which you do choose what you do. Like we went to the beach today, right? you choose to do that, but you don't know what's going to happen there. I mean, I went to the beach today, and what did I find interesting? I found the planes coming out of LAX and the seagulls flying across in the same space. Well, I don't know that's going to happen, and I don't know why I find it interesting. But I did. I found that quite exciting. But I'm not in control. It's an illusion that we have that. We have some element of control. We have a power. We have a field of power. I mean, for example, when I was in education. And on national committees around research in the arts, I had a certain amount of power, which meant that I could influence the way certain cultural things happened. But our power frame is quite limited. Even the power frame over what happens, including whether we're going to suddenly get cancer. Right, we got no control over it. We may improve our diet. My poor friend Ladislav Galita, who was a great filmmaker from Croatia, absolutely wonderful person who lived very carefully, had his own garden, grew his own organic vegetables, went to the spring every day to get the water for him and his family, didn't smoke, drunk some wine, but nothing like what I do. And he was there forever as far as I was concerned, and then he's gone. And it's kind of that randomness, and he had no control. And despite having lived very well, what did he say? He said, "Oh, this is getting maudlin." I'm sorry. He said, I did a show there, and he said, tomorrow may be the day when tomorrow never comes. So that was, and he was kind of aware that it means you're not in control of those things, and I'm talking too much. I'm easily tempted to talk.
Okay. Yeah, after seeing China Tea and hearing you talk a little bit about
Can you hear okay?
Can you hear? No.
Okay. After seeing China Tea and
yes.
hearing you talk a little bit about composition in terms of music, I was wondering, during the 60s and 70s, what kind of overlap was there between experimental music and the experimental film scene?
Yes, that's. I mean, I was always involved with music. I've said it lots of times. I played jazz, but not with a great deal of talent, but with some good people and in good bands. And it was something that mattered to me. I was always very influenced by jazz and improvisation. I preferred jazz and if I can say it, black music like Little Richard and so on, to certainly to pop music and to normal pop music and certainly to folk music and all those sort of things. So I was much more interested in and engaged with strong rock type music that came from that culture. But at the same time, I worked very closely from time to time with a person who I was in a band with called Keith Rowe, who was a radical guitar player who did all sorts and still is. And he came to work with a group of people who were coming from the classical tradition rather than the jazz tradition, and introducing improvisation into that, and I got very interested in that sort of crossover between lyric things that came from classical music and improvisation and visual scores and things like that.
That was AMM?
Sorry?
That was AMM? AMM?
AMM.
Yeah.
This was AMM, and there was an English equivalent to Cage and so on, which was Cornelius Cardew, not terribly well known, but actually quite influential and well known in the UK. And he was exploratory in. He did visual scores, and visual scores being sort of diagrammatic music. I'm always not sure that people know what I mean when I say it, but there's a big tradition of composers who switched away from writing the dots in conventional notation and started to experiment with a kind of more open notation that was for controlled improvisation, and I was interested in that, and also a big interest in that territory which people talk about as synesthesia. That is, what is the correspondence? Is there a correspondence? What is the correspondence between colour and colour transformation and musical transformation? And so I got very interested in that. And of course it's in the experimental film history, right from the beginning, abstract film was talked of as visual music. And I still am working with that in one way or another, certainly in the colour combinations. I think I'm orchestrating them as if they were chords. I'm not thinking I'm going to make this particular chord, but the same sort of sensibility that you have in saying, like, these kind of notes make an interesting, particular kind of interesting relationship. I get the same thing when I'm doing. You see it in Infinity, the way that there's a gradual shift between the greens and then the strong colours that come over each other and moving towards the pink, and that is an orchestration of colour, which is for me almost identical. I'm not a synesthetic. Not a genuine, it's synesthesia is a medical condition. I didn't know that. One of my PhD students told me that. I was interested in synesthesia, but I thought it was always something that people chose to make relationships between colour. But some people can't get away from it. They actually, and it's also between numbers and colours. That's not uncommon for synesthesia. That some people when they can do it with certain words will bring up colours or sounds. I don't experience that, but that thing interests me because I suspect that something of the same way in which we coordinate our experience is there for sound and for colour. I don't have it as an automatic thing, but for sure a lot of those things that are going on in my own films, including when there's no colour, the way that certain movements come, the one with the snow, which is H2O, is only crossings of snow at different speeds, right? And that's an orchestration. The way in which I structure it is a response to the effect that you're getting by combinations of different speeds, tempo.
When you're constructing that,
Sorry?
When you're constructing that, do you feel like you're making those decisions when you're editing and putting it all together?
Almost entirely.
Do you feel that you're doing it intellectually or mentally or emotionally?
Well,
what's your experience of it?
It's certainly intuitively, and I'm not. I don't begin with a plan. I am a bit analytical. I'm actually asking myself, why am I doing it, or what am I doing? I'm not if there's an intellectual bit, it comes kind of slightly post hoc to the actual doing of it, because I'm interested in the way that the art process brings out things that you have in you that you in a way don't know are there. That's why I'm rather against conceptual art and planned concepts, because it inhibits those things coming out that you don't know are there, making themselves conscious through the practice of the work. So there, yeah, we're doing all right.
Sorry.
What's this?
Yeah, see, there's an accident.
I don't know. I'm going to sue you.
It feels in a way that you've been almost like a genealogist of people's experience of the granular way that the world operates on.
Yeah.
And it feels that you must be noticing changes going on,
Yeah.
particularly since you work in all these media.
Yeah.
It's almost like a contrapuntal
Yeah.
process.
Yeah.
So I'm fascinated to find out what you discovered by accident or on purpose about the last 30 or 40 years, what people receive or get invaded by this kind of experience.
Not enough, I suspect. That's difficult. Yes, one of the big problems, personally, a big problem. The earliest work that I did was all pretty much about the materiality of film, right? The celluloid, the scratches, the dust and the sprockets, and the materiality of the condition of presentation, right? Castle One had a light bulb that constantly opened up the space, and it was about what is present for the audience, not what is represented as a kind of imaginary past, right? And that was there right from the beginning. And it was called by various critics and even by myself structural materialism, right? And so a lot of that early work was actually somehow or other around the film medium as a physical material. Right, now the big crisis comes when there's a switch from the materiality of film, even in the first instance, to videotape, which is still a bit physical, but nothing like. You don't handle it, you don't see the picture when you've got a piece of videotape, because it's a magnetic recording. But in particular, with the digital, there is no medium with the digital, right? It doesn't. It's not a medium.
And yet, it's becoming more where it's invading technology in very physical ways.
So now, for me as an artist, one of the big problems was either do I just stay with the old problem and continue to work on that symbol for materiality, which is the film material, or do I endorse the technology which is inevitably going to take over in a sense, and I recognized it was taking, because I started working with we called it computer art in the beginning, and I learned to program, but I could see from the beginning, and I wrote about it, that in some ways the digital was going to incorporate all the other parts of what was the film medium, because digital is massively incorporated incorporatable. It incorporates text, it incorporates sound, it incorporates film, and now it incorporates through printing, digital printing, the sculptural. It incorporates all, and it can translate continuously between one and the other.
Yeah.
So you can put in data which comes from text, and that text data can be used to make images, even though they don't start as images. And so you've got that the digital is a infinitely abstract, the greatest abstraction, and it doesn't exist. It does exist only as electrical impulses. We all think about it as zeros and ones and so on, but it isn't. It's just like very fast electrical impulses off and on, and that's all it is. So for me, at least one major part of what seemed to be my aesthetic, again I'm going on a lot, the major part of what seemed to be my aesthetic was the work with the materiality of film. I had to, in a sense, say, okay, well, if I abandon that, what's left of the structural material? The only solution I've found to that, in a way, is to focus more into the condition of the spectator, and the condition of the spectator as a kind of physical relationship, physical and mental relationship to what's being seen, and again, to resist illusion, resist representational illusion. Again, not 100% sure of that. I'm not sure if my anti-narrative thing is more than a kind of crutch that I work on. I don't know. Something like that. Must be getting to beer time again.
Yes.
It's beer time.
Malcolm,
Oh,
can you
yes.
describe?
I'm going to come over, Joanna.
Could you
Go on,
describe?
you can give me a hard time, other people don't.
I'm not going to give you a hard time. I very much like Finity.
Oh, did you? Good.
Yes, beautiful. But I'd really like to know the differences between the original, was a film projection, right, of multi-screens.
Of which one?
The very first version of Finity.
Right, okay.
And how you saw the differences and the kind of transformation it went through. Because that relates
Yeah.
to what you were just talking about.
Well, Finity in the first instance was a 6-screen thing, but actually matted onto 3 video projections. So each represented effectively 2 screens, although occasionally I had to construct them so that they looked like they were coming across the barrier. So they were pretty much solidly in sync, which is actually not difficult to do with video. It was very difficult to do it with film, but it's not difficult to do it with video. They worked over a very wide space, so the spectator's choice was really physical, in the sense that you're looking, because it was very large. I mean, it was the projection was at least 1.5 times the width of this space, right? So it was very, and anyone sitting in the audience, you kind of, with your peripheral vision, you could see things, but you were choosing, and it was there were far more. It was like linear developments. You get one, and it plays across the screen or across the screen this way. I couldn't do that with the single screen because I could mat in, and I'm not sure whether I've made the right decision on that, but some of the things which had been, as it were, linear across the space are now simultaneously on the rectangle, with a certain sense of the movement across. The longer work, the larger work, actually held the held duration better than the. I could take that was it went for 45 minutes, and it held that. It felt coordinated all the way through in 45 minutes, and some of the interplay backwards and forwards was probably more evident in that. But when I did the first one, I made it the same length, and the first single screen version, I made it the same length, and I didn't feel like it held that duration. Whereas this version, even though I think there's a few things I might change but they're small, this I think holds its duration and the flow between one. There are sections in a way. I know more where they are than the audience might, but for me there are certain sections, and they are flowing together much better in this version of the single screen, and it has more. In a funny way, it has more coherence than the large multi-projection. It's a bit too close to know whether it's this. I'm still everything I'm doing. I still work on it if I feel like it. There's no definitive. For me, there's no definitive version.
So did you take out certain sections altogether, or did you cut down your sections when you?
I think all the sections are there. Mm-hmm. It's just that some are more compressed than others. A few things have got lost. There's some things I definitely like better in the multi-screen version. The first railway journey with the out the railway window, I think works better in the single screen, because it's like you're seeing the whole of all the windows on a railway carriage, and it's you're getting something. You don't get it quite so strongly here, but that's a visual thing. There's a lot of this which is symbolic, right? It's a lot of this has a kind of allegorical thing, really. And it's structured like it's a journey, right? It's very clearly that there's an element. The first part of it is structured like a journey. It's you begin with this in this place where there's the sea, and then a beach, and then a railway journey. But it doesn't stay strictly with that. But there is that kind of structure. Well, you don't get. I'm glad almost you don't get that so clearly in this version. It feels more things layered on top of each other. Done?
Sure.
Class?
Well, I want to thank you so much for coming, and I hope it seems like you had a good visit.
I have, very good, yeah.
And it's been such an immense pleasure for us to have these shows and to have you here, especially in person. So thank you.
I'm very grateful for all these people. I'm grateful for the people who come and they're doing me a favour. Thank you very much. Nice.
Great.
I want to pee in a drink.